Hello everyone, today we're going to be doing the philosophy of parts and wholes, or Mereology. First, we're going to start with some core ideas. This is going to be part one. It will cover proper parthood, proper or improper parthood, overlap, disjointness, product, sum, difference, and universe. These are the core ideas in Mereology. If you're going to read anything on the subject, or if you're going to learn anything on the subject, you're going to need at least a decent understanding of these ideas. So first, proper parthood. Proper parthood is when you have a whole thing which has parts, and there's more than one part. So a proper part is going to be just one of the many parts that a whole has. So if you think of a wall, the wall is composed of many boards or many bricks or something. The bricks are each a proper part of the wall because they form parts of the wall, and they are also not the whole wall at the same time. So first, let's look at some of the properties that proper parthood has. The first one is transitivity. If x is a proper part of y and y is a proper part of z, then x is a proper part of z. That sounds really complicated. It really just means that if one thing is a part of one whole, and that whole is a part of a bigger whole, then the first thing is a part of the bigger whole. So if you have a board that's a part of the wall, and the wall is a part of a house, then the board is a part of the house. Pretty clear. Next, we have asymmetry. If x is a proper part of y, y is not a proper part of x. So if the board is a proper part of the wall, then the wall is not a proper part of the board. Then finally, for proper parthood, we have irreflexivity. X is not a proper part of x. Nothing is a proper part of itself, because to be a proper part, you have to be less than the whole. The wall is not a proper part of itself because every part of the wall is contained in the wall. But the board is a proper part of the wall because the board is not the entire wall. Next, on the core ideas, we have proper or improper parthood. Improper parthood is similar to proper parthood in every way, except that it's reflexive. So it has transitivity. The board is a part of the wall is a part of the house, so the board is a part of the house. It also has asymmetry. The board is a part of the wall is not a part of the board. However, it also has a different property. Instead of irreflexivity, it's reflexive. The board can be a proper part of itself. The wall can be a proper part of itself. So improper parthood is similar, except that the whole actually can count as an improper part of itself. Next, we have overlap. This is just when you have two objects and they share a part. So the first property that this has is non-transitivity. Think of the cornerstone in two walls. Both walls have the cornerstone as a proper part, but they aren't the same object. The two different walls aren't the same thing. They have a part in common. So it's non-transitive. Just because x overlaps with y and y overlaps with z, it doesn't mean that x overlaps with z. Because one wall could have a cornerstone that it shares with the second wall, and the second wall can have a cornerstone that it shares with the third wall. But that doesn't mean that the first wall and the third wall share a cornerstone. Next, it's symmetric. If x overlaps with y, then y overlaps with x. That's pretty simple. You know, if wall 1 has a cornerstone and wall 2 has the same cornerstone, then wall 1 overlaps with wall 2, and wall 2 overlaps with wall 1. Finally, on the subject of overlap, everything is overlapping with itself. Everything is reflexively overlapping. If a wall exists, the wall overlaps with all of the parts that it has. Everything overlaps with itself. Next, we have disjointness. Disjointness is just not being connected or not overlapping with something at all. So it's non-transitive. If a wall is disjoint with a car and a car is disjoint with a board, that doesn't entail that the board is disjoint with the wall, because the wall could be disjoint with the car could be disjoint with the board, and the board could just be a part of the wall. Next, disjointness is symmetric. If the wall is disjoint with the car, then the car is disjoint with the wall. Nothing can be asymmetrically disjointed. Everything which is disjoint with another thing is actually disjoint with it. Next, we have irreflexivity. Nothing is disjoint with itself. Everything has to overlap with itself, otherwise it wouldn't exist. Next, we have the idea of a product. A product is just a common aspect between two objects. So the cornerstone in a wall is the product of the wall. It's the thing which overlaps between both of them. It's the shared part. We have the idea of a sum. That is the whole, which consists of any two arbitrary objects. So two walls create the sum of two walls, or a human and a car create the sum of a human and a car. Then we have difference. Difference is the largest object that's contained within X that does not overlap with Y. So if you think about two walls that intersect, every board in the wall that isn't at the corner is going to be part of the difference between the two objects. Next, we have the idea of the universe, which is the arbitrary sum of everything that exists. This is just all of the things which are in existence taken together. It doesn't necessarily form a whole, but in your mind you can add all of these things together. Then finally, we have the ideas of atoms, gunk, and non-atomicity. So an atom world, or a world with atoms, has these things which have no proper parts. Remember, a proper part has to be less than the sum of the whole, or less than the sum of its parts. But a being without proper parts just has a single part. The part is the same as the whole. So an atom is something which you can't break down into smaller parts. Next, there's gunk. A gunky world would be one that has no lack of parts. Every level you go farther down, there's always more parts. There's no atoms. There's no bottom level physical things. You just keep going and keep finding new parts at each new level you dig down to. And then finally, a non-atomic world would be a world that had atoms and gunk. So one has just atoms, one has just gunk, and then a non-atomic world has both atoms and gunk. Next, we're going to be looking at something called the special composition question, which is, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for two objects to compose a whole? So think of two atoms. At what point do they come together to make something else? Well, that's what the question is about. When does the whole come into being? And there are, of course, three possible answers: never, sometimes, and always. The people who think that two atoms or two objects never come together to form a whole are called eliminativists. They believe in eliminativism. The people who believe that sometimes a whole is composed out of parts go by different names. Their position is usually a little bit more complicated. And then the people who believe that two objects always compose a third object are called Universalists, or they believe in Mereological Universalism. Okay, first, eliminativism, separate things. So, eliminativists believe that it doesn't matter what relationships two simples or two pieces of gunk stand in, they will always lack a whole which is more than just the sum of its parts, or just a whole at all. They may even believe that there is like a well-defined idea of a whole, but they will not think that that whole could even possibly be instantiated in reality. So let's just look at some quick motivations for being an Eliminativist. Separate things. Just imagine two physical simples. They could be right next to each other, they could be rubbing up next to each other, they could be a million miles away. There doesn't seem to be any point where they turn into like this magical third thing, which is like a whole. There's no appearance of something else here. It doesn't matter what relationship they kind of stand in. So there just doesn't seem to be anything there for the whole to do. It doesn't seem to appear. Next, let's look at vagueness. Think of a chair. People have this like common intuition that like chairs and plants and water exists, but like at what point does a chair stop being a chair? If I scrape off the first like 5 or 6 atoms of the chair, it still seems to be a chair. But if I take it apart and I keep scraping off parts of the chair, eventually there will be nothing there. And if that's the case, then it would seem that the chair just never existed, or there was never like an actual like point at which the chair stopped existing. But if the chair didn't exist at the end, and there was no point that it stopped existing, then it also didn't exist at the beginning. The chair was just something in our minds. And then finally, the third motivation for eliminativism is called overdetermination. This is when the same action has 2 complete causes. If you think of the parts of a whole that we observe, there doesn't seem to be anything for the whole to do. If you looked at a cell in a human being, and you saw all of its parts whirling around at top speeds, and you described each one of its parts in its totality, it seems like you would have a complete description of the whole as well. There's nothing for the idea of the whole to do, or the existence of the whole to do in this situation. The whole doesn't seem to be anything more than the sum of its parts, because if you describe the parts correctly, you will describe the entire whole. That'll be all for eliminativism. Next, we have a couple different answers to sometimes. Sometimes objects compose a third object or a whole. The first answer that people have is spatial contiguity. This is just being next to another object. So if you're contiguous with another object, you would be composing a whole with it. Some people believe this, but this is generally not a defended position in Mereology. Like the fact that I picked up a cup does not mean that the cup and me form a new thing. So while spatial contiguity accounts for some basic instinct about the special composition question, which is that you kind of have to be like in contact with the thing that you compose a whole with, but while it does account for that, it doesn't seem to account for the fact that when you pick something up, you don't compose a whole new thing with that object you picked up. Next, we have organicism. This is the position of Peter van Inwagen. He thinks that for any 2 objects to compose a whole, they have to be part of an organism. His reason for thinking this is that organisms can persist with or without any specific set of simples. So a human being at the beginning of their life has a certain set of atoms in their body, and then over time they eat food, their cells are replaced, and by the time they die, they might not have a single simple left in their body from when they started. So this is going to give us like a neat answer to the special composition question. It's just as long as you're part of a living being, then you are composing a whole. Next, we have Powerism. This is the idea that 2 simples, or 2 pieces of gunk, compose a whole when there is an emergent property which isn't reducible to the whole. This will give you very exact parameters for when composition occurs. This will avoid vagueness. The chair might not have any emergent properties or powers, but if you think of a human being, maybe the human's mind has emergent properties, or some versions of quantum mechanics, or interpretations of quantum mechanics, require this idea of the whole having some properties that the parts don't. Next, we have this excluding implausible wholes. Universalists are going to be committed to the idea that your left leg and the moon compose a loon. They're going to be committed to a bunch of very strange objects if they believe that two objects always compose a third object. But that's not the case on Powerism, Powerism, because the Powerist believes that there needs to be an emergent property that's based on the parts that make it up. Next, this solves overdetermination. Because there is more on Powerism in the world than just the parts, overdetermination isn't an issue because a description of the whole will actually include more than just a description of the parts. Maybe it will explain why the parts act the way they do. Organicism again, it gives you the same answer as organicism, but it also tells you when an organism is present. And then finally, this can also account for spatial contiguity, because to be an organ or an organism, usually you need some sort of spatial contiguity. The next answer in the sometimes category is brutalism. Brutalism says that everything else fails to capture our basic instincts about composition, so we should just accept that some things compose wholes and some things don't, and it's just brute why some things do and some things don't. Then the final answer is universalism, or always. Two objects always compose a whole. Doesn't matter which objects, doesn't matter what the relationship is, they always compose a whole. So this is committed to the principle of unrestricted composition. Whenever two things exist, there exists some fusion of those two things. Now, universalism has a couple motivations. One is that it solves vagueness. You don't need to worry about when the chair stops becoming a chair because everything always composes an object. Every object might not be a chair, but they always compose a something. The next is the laws of nature. Every part of the material world seems to follow these same set of rules. This kind of implies, or at least the universalist would say that it implies that there's like some force holding all of these parts in place. They're all following the same patterns, and they think that this implies that they're all part of the same whole. And then finally, monism. Wave function monism is a view which entails that the universe as a whole has this emergent property of the wave function, and it is dependent on this, and everything that we know about the universe is emergent from this more fundamental single whole thing, which would imply that everything is just part of this whole, though this is a specific kind of universalism. This section is going to cover mereological hierarchy, which will structure reality into different levels, some being more fundamental than others. An eliminativist won't be interested in this section simply because this section will require a belief that there are some parts and there are some wholes, and that there aren't just single things that have no proper parts. Okay, first, grounding. Grounding is an idea in Mereology which is not exclusive to Mereology, but here what we're talking about is a dependency relationship. If you're familiar with scholastic philosophy, this is very, very similar. I would say probably the same as, or in many cases, the same as an essentially ordered causal series. This is just a dependency relationship for our purposes here, though. Next, we have hierarchy. The natural world is divided into a hierarchy of levels generated by a part-whole relation. The whole exists, the part exists, one of them depends on the other. Maybe they depend on each other, but in different ways. But yeah, there are these different levels of parts, wholes, maybe a different kind of whole, which is composed of other wholes. Next, we have irreflexivity. No level of the hierarchy is higher than itself. We have transitivity. If one level is higher than another, then a third level, which is higher than the first, is higher than the second. So if x is higher than y, and y is higher than z, then x is higher than z as well. Then there's asymmetricality. If level x is higher than level y, then it is not the case that level y is higher than x. A level can't be both lower and higher than another level at the same time. Next, we have the tiling constraints, which is composed of two beliefs. One is no gaps. Everything is either a fundamental entity or grounded in a fundamental entity. There is nothing in existence which is dependent but doesn't depend on anything. Non-fundamental but has nothing lower than it. And then there is the idea of no overlaps. No fundamental thing stands in a part-whole relationship with any other fundamental thing. The simple reason for this is that if they did, then they wouldn't be fundamental. They would be grounded in something else which is more fundamental than themselves. Now, for the answers to the question on fundamentality. The first one is pluralism, or that the parts are more fundamental. On this view, the whole is grounded in the parts, or has a dependency relationship to the parts. The first motivation for this view is that you can learn everything about a whole by looking at its parts. This is going to assume that something like Powerism is false and that overdetermination is a successful argument on some level. The next motivation is that parts can exist without being part of any specific whole, but wholes can't exist without any of their parts. The part, like your arm can fall off and, it can keep existing, but if your head falls off, you stop existing, while your head and your body don't. The next is heterogeneity. This is just that all of the fundamental things in a universe where parts have priority are going to be of the same kind. There's one kind of simple, and they just interact in a variety of ways. And if part priority is true, then this heterogeneity is going to be a feature, or probably going to be a feature, of the simples which make up the universe. Then we have the second answer, which is monism. This is going to say that wholes, specifically the cosmic whole, is fundamental. There are a couple motivations for this. The first is gunk. Remember the idea of gunk. This is the idea that there's no base level parts. Every time you go to a lower level of reality, there's always more and more parts. If wholes aren't grounding parts, then gunk it's very hard to see how gunk could exist if there is a fundamental level of reality. Like, if you believe that there is a bottom level and that there's no bottom level going farther down, the bottom level has to be on the top. The whole has to be grounding the parts. Otherwise, there is no fundamentality present. Next is that you can't learn everything about wholes from their parts. There are features of, again, certain aspects of quantum mechanics where you can't learn everything, well, certain interpretations. There are features of certain interpretations of quantum mechanics which mean that you can't, or which entail that you can't learn everything about the parts just by studying them. You have to look at the whole as a whole. There's also things you can learn about chemical structure and biological structure and even consciousness that you can't learn just by looking at the parts. You have to view the whole to understand these processes or these objects. The final answer to the question about fundamentality is a mixture. People that believe in a mixture usually believe in the existence of two different kinds of wholes. Some are substantial or natural wholes, and some are artificial wholes. This is very closely wedded to some version of Powerism. The substantial or natural whole is going to be an object which has an emergent property, which isn't reducible to its parts. An artificial whole is going to be an object which doesn't have an irreducible property. An artificial whole is going to be a whole that doesn't have an irreducible property that is in a relationship to its parts. If you think of two human beings, both human beings, on this view at least, have the non-reducible property of consciousness. But if you look at two human beings together, standing next to each other, there's no property that they have just like existing that they don't have individually. All of the properties of them together are reducible to the properties they have separately. So on this view, the cosmic whole is made up of a bunch of substantial wholes, but the cosmic whole, the entire universe, is an artificial object. It's something which is mind-dependent, unlike the existence of like a person or a water molecule. There are a couple arguments for this. One is against monism. The argument is based off of duplication. So you just imagine the entire universe. The entire universe has fundamentality. It is the base level of reality, is this whole universe. Well, you take this in conjunction with the idea that fundamentality is an intrinsic property that the universe has. Well, what if you duplicated the universe and put another universe next to it? Suddenly, the first universe wouldn't be fundamental because the entire collection of real things is the most fundamental reality. So you were able to change an intrinsic property of the universe just by changing something outside of it. That seems to go against the idea that the fundamentality of the whole, the fundamentality of the universe, is an intrinsic property. Next, we have the idea that you can learn everything about the cosmic whole from its substantial parts, but you can't learn everything about those parts from knowing about their parts. So you can learn everything about the universe by studying its like the substances that make it up, but you can't learn everything about like a human's mind from studying its brain. And then the final motivation is that this allows for the existence of gunk because it makes some wholes more fundamental than their parts, and that's all you need for the possibility of gunk in the universe. Yeah, I hope you learned something.